So I told you about this woman from Finland who let me use her phone, who, by the way, I said in an early episode was from England, but she isn't. She's from Finland. And we actually became conference buddies. And even though I ended up skipping, most of the conference, because again, I decided I was going to drop out, so I figured, why bother? We ended up quickly bonding and having a really fun night out in Gorizia and in Novo Gorica. I remember we bought some beers and we kind of drank them. And as we walked around, some roadies and wandered. And I remember at one point we ended up in like a laundromat that was open and we climbed into the dryers and took pictures. We didn't turn them on or anything. We just hopped inside and took some pictures. And then we ended up at a bar that was located on the second floor of a building somewhere in the city center. And I remember that it was a bar for young people. Like, I was 27 at the time, but I felt like the people there were like 19 or 20. And I remember them being really fascinated by us. Maybe they could tell that we were tourists, or maybe maybe this place was designated for like, I don't know, as a youth watering hole and the old fogies and quotations kind of stood out like a sore thumb. But I remember these poor young kids coming up to us and telling us about the dire state of finances in Italy. Again, this was in 2010. This was the era of austerity. This is when the Great Recession was really being felt, and it was kind of in like, the deep end of the economic, valley. That a lot of measures were being taken to deal with the debt crisis and so on and so forth. And I remember this one guy in particular almost begging me to go back to Canada and like spread the word about banking corruption in Europe and in Italy. And it was just really, really sad. I remember feeling really sad that these young Italians, hearing them talk about their fears about their financial futures, which, as we all know, unfortunately, was very prescient in its foretelling, right? Like, a lot of what they feared kind of came into being, but in a very different way. We got a very different economic result, right? We got housing inflation, we got asset inflation, not quite a recession that saw, money and disappear and debt consume everyone, but kind of the opposite. But I remember also just being really impressed by these people, like with their knowledge of like European economics. And this was just a very interesting cross-cultural learning experience for me at the time. And it's one of the things that I love, about traveling, random bar chats with people from different places. Honestly, you just never know who you're going to meet and what you're going to learn. And so after that random series of like lectures, because really we were being told what was going on. It wasn't a lot of back and forth, but I was fascinated in listening to what they had to say anyways. I remember we ended up going over the border to Slovenia and we ended up going to a casino. And one of the first things that really stood out to me when I went to this casino in Slovenia was that there was like this giant free buffet, like right by the entrance. Like, I've heard of like free buffets at like adult dance entertainment venues, if we will, although I don't know if that's actually true, if that's just something that's like on American television. But this is the first time that I've ever seen a free buffet at a casino. And it was a very weird thing to see, but based on how busy the buffet was, I felt like the food was a major draw for, those people, to go to the casino, which maybe was a cultural thing. But I don't know, in the context of the conversations that I had just had with the young Italians, I felt simultaneously opposing things going on in my head, right? So a part of me was thinking, there was something a little bit uncomfortable about a gambling establishment kind of luring in people with free food during a recession. But also, seeing it work as a ploy. People were, maybe gambling, in the hopes of winning like a better life. But I don't know, just seeing like free food as a draw and then people coming in there, but then spending money during a time when money was very scarce to, I guess hopefully win their way out of, this crisis was just, I don't know, it was something that always stuck with me as being a little odd, a little unsettling. But even though I felt a little, weird about the whole thing, I did ended up enjoying a free plate of full food. And despite, my own poverty, given how much debt I was taking on at the time, um, you know, I took my chances with a slot machine and I lost, 20 euros in less than 5 minutes. But hey, life is a bit of a gamble, right? You have to take risks. So this random beer soaked evening of bar and site hopping, highlighted for me just the beauty of meeting new people and the random adventures that can come if you allow yourself to be open and just say yes and keep on saying yes, like improv, yes and. Now, unfortunately, I haven't kept in contact with my conference buddy, but I remember her fondly, as well as our fun nights out. So if at some point in time in the present or future, if you happen to chance upon this podcast and you hear this, just know that I remember the fun night out that we had, and I miss you, and I hope you're doing well. The older you get and the more you travel and make your way through life, the more you realize you really are just a tourist on this planet. That's what you're basically doing in life. You're playing the role of a tourist. And I know that it sounds like such basic philosophy, such a basic philosophical thing to say, but I think it's really true, right? The more of the world you see, the more people you meet, the more you realize that. And now at the age of 40, when time really feels like it's speeding up, that things go by really quickly and that you're playing a much more observant role even while you're sort of acting and doing things and to some extent have more power and control than you do when you're younger. Something like like that Alfred Hitchcock like vertigo view where things look like they're going forward and backwards at the same time. Like time seems to be moving forward more quickly, but you're doing more things and you feel like somehow you're in more control. But oddly enough, the more you learn, the less, it feels like, I don't know, people just flow into and out of your life. A scant few end up sticking around for a long time. And even though the places you've been and like the things you've done become foggier with time, the impression they leave on you, fleeting though it may be, it's ultimately what defines you. Had I not met this person, I mean, first of all, who knows if I would have ended up even calling my mother or when, you know what I mean? But secondly, I wouldn't have ended up maybe even doing anything that night, or at least anything as random or as fun. This person definitely had a bit of joie de vivre in them and was definitely a bit of the leader, and I was happy to follow. And I don't know, I think that's the beauty of solo travel, taking in the energy, the experience, and the personality of other people you meet along the way, rather than sticking to the safety of the people that which is what you tend to do when you travel, with friends. That night, I would say, continues to inform my own behavior. It's why I go out alone at night when I travel. It's why I strike up conversations with people at bars. It's why I, try to encounter people online. It's why I choose to, marry the night, if you will, whenever I have the energy to do so. Even if it's not really like a late night. Like I rarely stay up, super late at night when I travel, but I do try to enjoy the nightlife in my own way. Of course, a little bit different at the age of 40 than, in your late 20s and, your early 30s. But that night out was definitely another seed that was planted, and that has grown into, a thriving entity that continues to be fed and nourished to this day. So while I was in Gorizia, I ended up visiting two other cities as day trips. One was Udine and the other was Trieste. Both cities had a really important impact on my future travel. One taught me the value of going off the beaten path, and the other taught me the value of looking beyond typical tourist destinations. Now, to be honest, I never plan on going to either city. But again, since at the time I had decided to drop out of my program and just, didn't bother attending the conference, as a result, other than of course attending my own panel to present. I did do that. I did show up to present my research. I participated on the panel, and I did attend just some of the evening sort of social events. So, just to clarify that, that I didn't, skip the entire thing. But, besides that, I decided to use the time during the day to see as much of Italy as I could. And these two cities were in close proximity and pretty easy to access by train. So, because this was 2010 and because I didn't really plan for these trips, I didn't have any printed, pages from MapQuest of these cities. And I also knew nothing about them. I literally just went to the train station and bought a ticket and, got on the train and exited where I exited and just kind of started walking around. In Udine, not knowing where to go or what to see, I remember making a right after exiting the station. I think it's because I saw McDonald's, like just off in the distance. And I just kept on going. And then I think at some point I just decided to make a left to go north. And so I ended up walking through like a residential neighborhood. They were nice houses, but nothing more than just houses. But I remember noticing that behind the houses, there was like this large metallic silver, I guess, wall or barrier. And I thought maybe there was like, I don't know, like a factory or like a warehouse or something, like train tracks behind there that was, this wall was being used to like block, protect people or like block out or like reduce noise or something. And I remember that I just kept on walking. And then at some point I just saw like a small opening down like a side street. I saw an opening in this fence. And so I said, hey, like, why not? I'm really curious to see what's over there. And I remember walking through the fence and I ended up in like a field. And off in the distance, I saw a mountain range, which I thought and then sort of confirmed later on that were in fact the Italian Alps. And similar to how I felt, gobsmacked by the view in Gorizia, but when I was up visiting the castle, I just remember standing there in awe, like, oh my God, I am here in Italy, and this poor kid, from Toronto is staring at the freaking Alps. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were far away, and I, wasn't at the foot of the mountain or anything. They were off in the distance, but still, I remember and felt, I remember, and I still remember that feeling, that rush of excitement. And yes, even like a little taste of privilege, something I never really had, even though, I was standing alone, in the middle of this random field in this random city that I never even heard of. That was definitely another, again, moment where another seed was planted. That sense of wanderlust, of wandering and letting chance encounters and moments of beauty just occurring. That if you go off the beaten path and don't follow a set touristic itinerary, who knows what you'll see and what you'll encounter. Now, granted, and not to ruin this romanticized moment, but that also means accepting that these jaw-dropping views will likely be flanked by elongated periods of boredom or mundane surroundings. Like the 15 minutes before I chanced upon this wall opening, I was walking on a street that just had like a bunch of houses and like I think some warehouses too. And then the time afterwards was basically the same until I made my way to like the northern part of the city, I think. I've honestly tried to piece together many years after the fact, using Google Maps where I was exactly, and the pictures I took while I was there to kind of map out my route. But honestly, all of this was to no avail. And not to further dump on this romanticized moment, but you also get a pretty spectacular view of the Alps from the city's castle in the center of the city, which, like most Europeans, is perched on a mountain, again, in the center of the city, like Gorizia. So yes, I did get to see the Alps from a better sort of vantage point. But nonetheless, life is taking about these small gambles and seeing if you hit like a little mini jackpot. And when traveling, like, why not take the road less traveled? Everyone sees the view, of the Alps from the castle, but few likely have ever seen it from from where I did, in the middle of this random field. So, so my first encounter is just a little esoteric. My first encounter of this kind of privilege, of this beauty, is esoteric, and it's special to me, and that's what makes it so wonderful. And that's, I think, what's really important about traveling and traveling on your own too, is that, especially in the era of social media, just trying to make your experiences unique to yourself, like not necessarily doing what you're expected to do or getting the pictures and the views that everyone tells you to see, but to allow yourself that chance to make those memories and those experiences unique to yourself. I think that's what really matters. The other city that I visited was the enchanting Trieste. This mid-sized city on the other side of the Adriatic is not well known, but it's charming as it is lovely. It really is a hidden gem, one that, at least at the time, wasn't spoiled by mass tourism, and I don't believe it has been. Although recently, at the same time, some articles have started shining light on this obscure port city. And so, that might soon compromise its under the radar status. I guess what I'm saying is, get there and see it while you can before, mass tourism possibly ruins it. But that issue is for a completely different podcast. Similar to Udine, visiting Trieste taught me early on the value of veering off, the typical tourist path. This podcast is audio only by design, so I can't really show you any pictures, but Google images of Trieste, and you'll see what I'm talking about. In particular, the city's grand port and waterfront boulevard that runs around the bend and is at the base of like this semicircle mountain range. And interestingly enough, one of Trieste's suburbs is Prosecco. Yes, that Prosecco, the place where they make Prosecco, the sparkling wine. So again, like, go and visit it, while you can before it's spoiled. Um, And, had I not taken a chance and just showed up in Trieste by train and started walking around, I would have missed out on visiting, honestly, one of my favorite European cities, which I ended up revisiting again in 2015 when I actually returned to the same conference, because, again, I didn't drop out. It's an annual conference, so I decided to since this was the final year of my PhD, the year 2015, I decided to reattend this conference as a way to kind of bring my academic life sort of full circle. This was the first conference that I did in my PhD, career, and it was the last conference that I did in my PhD career as well. So my first true solo travel trip lasted only around 5 days, but it was honestly a life-changing 5 days. It's the trip that made me fall in love with travel, that thrusted me out of my comfort zones and dared me to live life, even for just a few days without a clear plan, which was, very atypical for me. On a more, metaphysical level, it also marked a pivotal moment in my life and opened up, that sliding door to an alternate reality, one where, like I said before, another version of me is living what is likely a very different life. And yet, given my recent move out of corporate office work and into the tourism and travel industry, I can't help but wonder, like, perhaps if these two timelines that split in Gorizia over 14 years ago have recently merged together. Like, maybe this parallel version of me was doing something travel related all this time, and by leaving my corporate job and, coming into the travel tourism industry, maybe I'm like merging these two timelines, together. Maybe I'm merging my timeline into his timeline, bringing me and my professional and, personal experience with me, you know, um, I'm doing all this content creation now because, maybe these souls have become one, a little, run, gay solo travel run sort of moment. You know what I mean? So I don't know, but what I do know is that Gorizia and the northeastern part of Italy will always have a special place in my heart because that's where gay solo travel took root. That's where all this truly began. I I learned so much about myself and developed a real sense of problem solving and independence in such a small amount of time. I mean, I've listed a few of the mistakes that I made, while traveling, and a few more include assuming the small bread and breakfasts take credit cards, which they don't. And I remember I had to run, like 3 blocks to an ATM machine to cash advance money off of my line of credit, and then run back to pay this lady, cash money that I owed her. I also assumed that like trains run everywhere all night long, or like they run like very early in the morning, which they don't. And so I actually had to quickly check out the night before my 6 a.m. flight that took off in Venice. And then I had to like run to the train station with my suitcase. And then I ran to catch the last train out of Gorizia to get into Venice. And then when I got to Venice, I missed the last airport shuttle bus. And then I had to pay like 50 euros, which completely destroyed me at the time. That was like still like 75 bucks Canadian, for a taxi to the airport. And it turns out I also learned that like airports, like, shut down. The Venice airport, at least at the time, like shut down at midnight. Like the doors locked at midnight because I made it there like 5 minutes early, 5 minutes earlier before the guard came around and started locking the doors. And I basically spent the night like watching these other like poor tourists who arrived like after midnight literally just sit outside in the cold March weather like all night long until security came and reopened the doors at 5 a.m. Like it was not great, so that was, again, just a lot of life lessons learned along the way. Some airports do not stay open 24 hours a day. Trains don't run 24 hours a day. Young me definitely learned a lot, on this trip. The fun I had with my conference buddy, the views I saw and the sites I visited, the taste of Italian food and wine, all this set the foundation for who I am today. But oddly enough, it was the mistakes that I made, and the mistakes that I make kind of on every trip I've done since, that in some ways really are the root of what compelled me to do what I do today. I love to not only talk about travel because of how it can affect you, but I love to talk about travel because I love to help people with travel, especially those who are apprehensive or anxious or nervous about traveling on their own, which, hey, I completely get, because one of the best parts of doing my PhD was the fact that it forced me to travel. I honestly don't know if I would have traveled if it wasn't for my PhD. That's the honest truth. So maybe in some very roundabout way, doing this PhD, being forced to travel, to go to conferences, to get on those planes and go to these places, all over, at least the Western world. Maybe this is the reason why I ultimately did my PhD, was really just to get me to travel. Traveling solo is, especially as a queer person, has made me more confident. It's made me more open-minded and a better rounded individual. And I firmly believe, I believe in the intrinsic value of traveling on your own because of those things. And, even though I do have mixed feelings about pursuing a PhD in the humanities and liberal arts, it also added to that building block of confidence, not only forcing me again to travel, but also being able to stand up in a room full of strangers and say, hi, this is me and this is where I'm from. And then presenting your research to people and hearing compliments, but also criticism of your research. Just all of that combined together made me, the person that I am today. And for that, I'm truly thankful, but it's also very weird because when I talk to people, and especially queer people who have never traveled on their own, it always takes me a bit aback, I guess for me, because it's just so normal. And here, again, I'm pleading bias and a bit of ignorance. And I'm not necessarily saying that I'm on a small mission to change that. Um, but I would like to help people who have that inkling, who have that yearning and that desire to kind of bite the bullet and book that ticket and just go somewhere on their own and just do it and not have to rely on other people or conquer their fear. I want to be able to sort of help them and compel them to discover, the beauty of gay solo travel, because it's a core part of who I am and it's made me, I think, a better person. So now I know what you might be thinking, right? Like, what makes this trip in particular like gay solo travel? I mean, I didn't really do anything gay per se. I didn't hook up with anyone and I didn't go to like a gay bar or club or whatever. But the experience of freedom or independence, existing as a queer person outside of a major city in my home country, um, it contributed to my personal growth as a person and thus as a queer person. And it kind of set the stage for more travel and I guess what you can say more overt, gay experiences later on. You know, all of what I did, even in this very beginning, kind of made me the queer person that I am, even if it was something as small as just kind of being openly gay in a place where, I wasn't entirely sure about how I would necessarily, be received. Nothing to say about, that area in particular, but just when you're so accustomed to living and being in a very particular space, in particular places like Montreal and Toronto that are, internationally renowned for being very gay and very queer friendly, just packing up and going across the Atlantic and going somewhere else, and just living as a queer person on your own just adds to the experience and I think just makes you a better, more confident person. And that essentially brings us to the end of the first travel related episode of Gay Solo Travel. And thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I hope you continue to do so as well. Again, you can follow me on Instagram at Traveler Gay Solo. That's Traveler with two L's. On TikTok at gay.solo.travel. On YouTube at Gay Solo Travel. As well as on Medium, where I write about a variety of things. Some more philosophical and poetic, others more practical, also under the name Gay Solo Travel. Join me next time for a whole new destination and whole new adventure, because honestly, who knows where I will take you next. Until then, safe travels.